In the unforgiving wilderness of 1847 Texas, where the line between civilization and savagery blurred like smoke in the wind, a single act of mercy would shatter everything a grieving widow thought she knew about enemies, survival, and the true meaning of family. What started as a desperate attempt to save a dying stranger's life would become a journey that challenged the deepest prejudices of the frontier and revealed that sometimes the greatest threats come not from those we fear, but from those we trust. Sarah McKinnon never imagined that the bleeding warrior she'd find collapsed near her well would become the bridge between two worlds at war, or that her decision to help him would force her to choose between the safety of everything she'd built and the dangerous path toward a truth that could cost her everything she held dear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard of the McKinnon homestead as Sarah stepped out to draw water from the well. The wooden bucket felt heavy in her weathered hands, a reminder of the countless mornings since her husband Thomas had been laid to rest beneath the old oak tree. 6 months had passed since the fever took him, leaving her alone with their 3 children in the harsh Texas wilderness of 1847. 8-year-old Emma was already tending to the chickens, her small hands scattering grain with practiced efficiency. The girl had grown up fast since losing her father, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to someone twice her age. 12-year-old Samuel worked in the vegetable garden, his young back bent over the tomato plants as he checked for hornworms. At 15, Mary helped her mother with the household chores, but Sarah could see the longing in her daughter's eyes whenever riders passed by on their way to town. The girl dreamed of dances and courtship, normal things for a young woman her age, but their isolated homestead offered little opportunity for such luxuries. The McKinnon farm sat 5 miles outside of Cedar Creek, close enough to receive occasional visitors, but far enough that help would take time to arrive if trouble came calling. Thomas had chosen this location for its fertile soil and reliable water source, never imagining he would leave his family to defend it alone. The house itself was modest but sturdy, built from local limestone with thick walls that could withstand both the brutal Texas heat and the occasional Indian raid that plagued the frontier settlements. As Sarah lowered the bucket into the well, she heard Emma's sharp cry from the chicken coop. "Mama, something's wrong with the chickens. They're all scattered and upset." Sarah hurried toward the coop, her long skirts catching on the rough wooden fence posts. The chickens were indeed agitated, clucking frantically and refusing to enter their shelter despite the morning feeding. Their behavior often signaled the presence of a predator, perhaps a fox or coyote looking for an easy meal. Following the direction of their distress calls, Sarah walked toward the back of the property, where the land sloped down toward a small creek. The grass here grew taller, providing cover for wildlife and, unfortunately, other unwanted visitors. She had learned to read the signs of the wilderness during her years on the frontier. Disturbed vegetation, unusual animal behavior, and the subtle shift in the morning bird songs all told stories to those who knew how to listen. What she found near the creek bank made her heart stop. A man lay motionless in the tall grass, his body twisted at an awkward angle. Dark stains covered his buckskin clothing, and flies buzzed around wounds that appeared to be made by both bullets and arrows. His long black hair was matted with dried blood, and intricate beadwork adorned his torn shirt. Even in his unconscious state, there was no mistaking what he was. This was a Comanche warrior, one of the fierce horsemen who struck terror into the hearts of frontier families across Texas. Sarah's first instinct was to run, to gather her children and barricade themselves inside the house until the man either died or left their property. The Comanche were known for their brutal raids on isolated homesteads, and many families like hers had simply vanished without a trace. The stories told around hearths throughout the territory spoke of burning cabins, stolen children, and settlers who met fates too horrible to speak aloud. But as she stood frozen in fear and indecision, the warrior stirred slightly. His lips moved, forming words in a language she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably that of someone calling out in pain and desperation. Despite every instinct screaming at her to flee, Sarah found herself taking a step closer. The man was young, perhaps no older than her late husband had been, and his wounds were severe enough that he posed little immediate threat, even if his intentions were hostile. Her practical frontier upbringing warred with her Christian conscience as she examined the injured warrior more closely. The bullet wounds appeared to be several days old, suggesting he had been shot by cavalry troops or perhaps rival tribe members during a raid gone wrong. Arrow wounds on his shoulder and Thigh indicated he had been in a fierce battle before stumbling onto their property. Without medical attention, he would certainly die within hours. Sarah had seen enough death during her years on the frontier. She had watched neighbors succumb to disease, injury, and violence while struggling to carve out a life in this unforgiving land. The sight of suffering, regardless of its source, awakened something deep within her that she couldn't ignore. Her mother had taught her that mercy was not selective, that Christian charity extended to all of God's children, even those who might be considered enemies. The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of her children, drawn by curiosity and concern over their mother's prolonged absence. Samuel reached her first, his young face paling as he took in the scene. "Mama, is he dead?" Before Sarah could answer, Mary and Emma joined them, both girls gasping at the sight of the wounded Comanche. Emma immediately hid behind her older sister, while Mary stared with the morbid fascination of someone encountering violence for the first time. "He's hurt bad, children," Sarah said quietly, her mind racing through the possible consequences of what she was about to propose. "We need to get him to the house and tend his wounds." Samuel's eyes widened with disbelief. "But, Mama, he's a Comanche. They're the ones who kill families like ours. Pa always said never to trust them." Sarah understood her son's fear and suspicion. Thomas had indeed warned them about the dangers posed by hostile Indian tribes, and his concerns had been well-founded. Raids were a constant threat, and many families had paid the ultimate price for letting their guard down. But, looking at this wounded man, barely clinging to life, she saw not a fearsome warrior, but a human being in desperate need of help. "Your father also taught us that we judge people by their actions, not their appearance," she replied, though her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. "This man hasn't harmed us, and he's in no condition to do so now. We can't just leave him here to die." The debate that followed revealed the depth of the children's fear and confusion. Mary argued that helping him might bring his tribe down upon them, seeking revenge or rescue. Samuel worried that nursing him back to health would only give him the strength to harm them later. Even young Emma, from behind her sister's skirts, whispered that the man looked scary and different from anyone she had ever seen. Their concerns were not unfounded. The frontier was no place for naive idealism, and helping a member of a hostile tribe could easily be seen as an act of treason against their own kind. Other settlers would not understand or approve of her decision, and word of her actions could make the family outcasts in their already small community. But Sarah had made up her mind. "We're going to help him because it's the right thing to do," she announced with finality. "Samuel, run to the house and fetch the old door we use for carrying heavy loads. Mary, bring clean sheets and the medicine box. Emma, you stay close to me." The process of moving the unconscious warrior to their house proved more difficult than anticipated. He was larger than Thomas had been, with the muscular build of someone accustomed to physical hardship and combat. Even with Samuel's help, Sarah struggled to lift the man onto the makeshift stretcher. His weight, combined with the awkwardness of navigating through tall grass and over uneven ground, left them all exhausted by the time they reached the house. They placed him in the small room that had once served as Thomas's office, a space separate from the main living areas that would provide both privacy and security. Sarah examined his wounds more thoroughly in the better light of the house, noting that while severe, they appeared to be healing poorly due to infection and lack of proper care. The bullet had passed through his side without hitting vital organs, but the arrow wounds were more concerning. One arrow point remained embedded in his shoulder, while the thigh wound showed signs of a deep infection that could prove fatal if left untreated. Drawing on the medical knowledge she had accumulated through years of frontier living, Sarah began the delicate process of cleaning and treating the warrior's injuries. She had learned basic surgery from the traveling doctor who visited their area twice a year, and had successfully treated everything from broken bones to serious infections among her own family and neighbors. The work was slow and careful. Using her sharpest knife, sterilized over the cooking fire, she carefully extracted the arrow point from the warrior's shoulder. The man groaned and stirred during the procedure, but never fully regained consciousness. His fever was high, and she recognized the signs of blood poisoning that could kill even the strongest man. For 3 days, Sarah and her children took turns watching over their unexpected patient. They gave him water when he was lucid enough to drink, changed his bandages regularly, and applied the herbal poultices that frontier wisdom claimed could draw infection from wounds. Mary proved surprisingly adept at nursing, showing a gentle touch and keen observation that helped track their patients' slow progress toward recovery. During those first days, the warrior spoke frequently in his delirium, calling out in Comanche words that none of them understood. Sometimes his voice carried the tone of command, as if he were leading men in battle. Other times it held the gentle cadence of someone speaking to loved ones. Sarah found herself wondering about his life, his family, and the circumstances that had brought him to their doorstep barely alive. On the fourth morning, she entered the room to check on him and found dark eyes watching her with careful intelligence. The fever had finally broken during the night, and though he was still weak from blood loss and infection, he was clearly aware of his surroundings and the identity of his caregivers. The moment of mutual recognition was charged with tension and uncertainty. Here was a Comanche warrior, traditional enemy of the Texas settlers, face to face with a frontier woman who had saved his life. Neither spoke for a long moment, each taking the measure of the other and trying to determine what would happen next. Finally, Sarah spoke softly, using the few Comanche words she had learned from traders and peaceful encounters over the years. Water? Food. Her pronunciation was probably terrible, but the intent was clear. The warrior nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. When she brought him a cup of water, he drank carefully, studying her with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how vulnerable she and her children were in this situation. Yet there was no hostility in his gaze, only a profound curiosity and what might have been gratitude. The children maintained their distance during these first conscious encounters, watching from the doorway with a mixture of fear and fascination. They had never seen a Comanche warrior up close, and his presence in their home challenged everything they had been taught about the relationship between their two peoples. As the days passed and the warrior grew stronger, a strange routine developed in the McKinnon household. Sarah continued to tend his wounds and bring him meals, while the children gradually overcame their initial terror enough to venture closer. The warrior, for his part, seemed content to rest and recover while observing the family that had taken him in. Communication remained limited, but gradually improved. The warrior, who had eventually indicated through gestures that his name was something that sounded like Swift Eagle, had picked up enough English words during raids and trading to engage in basic conversation. Sarah's knowledge of Comanche was even more limited, but necessity proved an excellent teacher for both of them. Through their halting exchanges, Sarah began to piece together the story of how he had come to be on their property. Swift Eagle had been part of a raiding party that had encountered a cavalry patrol several days' ride to the south. The battle had gone badly for the Comanche, with several warriors killed and others, including Swift Eagle, badly wounded. He had become separated from his surviving companions during the retreat and had been wandering alone, slowly bleeding and growing weaker when he had collapsed near their creek. The knowledge that he had been involved in a raid troubled Sarah, though she tried not to let her feelings show. She couldn't help but wonder if his party had attacked other homesteads like theirs, if families had suffered because of his actions. Yet the man she was nursing showed no signs of the savage cruelty that frontier stories attributed to Comanche warriors. He was polite, grateful for her care, and gentle in his interactions with her children when they finally worked up the courage to come close. One afternoon, as Sarah was changing the bandages on his shoulder wound, Swift Eagle spoke quietly in English. "Why you help me?" The question she had been expecting finally came, though she wasn't sure she had a good answer. "Because you needed help," she replied simply. He studied her face for a long moment. "Your people, my people, we fight. You're not afraid I hurt your children?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "If you're going to hurt us, you would have done it by now. You're getting stronger every day." Swift Eagle nodded slowly, and she could see that her trust in him carried weight. In a culture where honor and personal reputation were paramount, her willingness to place her family's safety in his hands was a profound gesture that he clearly understood and appreciated. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the following days, Swift Eagle began to share more about himself and his people. He told Sarah about his wife and 2 young children waiting for him in a Comanche village many days' ride to the west. He spoke of the pressure his people faced from the ever-expanding settlements, the loss of hunting grounds, and the cycles of violence that seemed to have no end. For Sarah, these conversations provided her first real insight into the Comanche perspective on the conflicts that plagued the frontier. She had always seen raids and attacks as senseless acts of savagery, but Swift Eagle's words painted a different picture. His people were fighting for their survival, their way of life, and their children's future in much the same way that settlers like her family were struggling to build a life in the wilderness. As understanding grew between them, Sarah found herself questioning many of the assumptions she had held about the Indian tribes. The man recovering in her home was intelligent, devoted to his family, and possessed of a complex moral code that, while different from her own, was clearly deeply meaningful to him. The children, too, began to see Swift Eagle differently as fear gave way to curiosity. Samuel started asking questions about Comanche horses and hunting techniques. Mary was fascinated by the beadwork on his clothing and wanted to know about the women who had created it. Even Emma, the youngest and most frightened, eventually worked up the courage to bring him wildflowers from the meadow behind the house. These small gestures of friendship and acceptance created a bond that transcended the racial and cultural barriers that supposedly made such connections impossible. For a brief time, the McKinnon homestead became a neutral ground where two peoples could meet not as enemies, but as human beings capable of understanding and respecting one another. But as Swift Eagle grew stronger and his wounds healed, the question of what would happen next began to weigh heavily on everyone's mind. He couldn't stay indefinitely, and his return to his people would end this unusual chapter in all their lives. Yet the knowledge that they had all gained from this experience had already begun to change them in ways they were only beginning to understand. The outside world, however, remained unaware of the drama playing out at the isolated McKinnon homestead. In the town of Cedar Creek and the surrounding settlements, life continued its normal rhythm of work, worry, and occasional violence. Rumors circulated about Comanche activity in the area, and patrols of Texas Rangers increased their vigilance in response to reports of missing cattle and disturbed campsites. It was into this environment of heightened tension that the next phase of their story would unfold, bringing challenges that would test the bonds formed during Swift Eagle's recovery and force Sarah to make choices that would affect not just her family, but the entire community that considered itself her home. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah first discovered Swift Eagle near the creek, and keeping his presence secret from the outside world was becoming increasingly difficult. The children had adapted to their unusual house guest with the resilience typical of frontier youth, but Sarah could see the strain of maintaining such a significant secret beginning to show in their behavior. Samuel had become unusually quiet during their weekly trips to town for supplies, no longer chattering about life on the homestead as he once did. Mary seemed nervous whenever neighbors stopped by, jumping at unexpected sounds and steering conversations away from anything related to their daily activities. Even young Emma had developed the habit of constantly checking the windows, as if expecting unwelcome visitors to appear at any moment. The situation became more complicated when Mrs. Henderson, their closest neighbor, arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon. The elderly widow lived alone on a small farm 3 miles to the east and made it her business to check on the McKinnon family regularly since Thomas's death. Her sharp eyes missed little, and her tongue wagged freely throughout the community about anything she considered noteworthy. "Sarah, dear, you look tired," Mrs. Henderson observed as she settled into her usual chair by the kitchen table. "Are you getting enough rest? It's not healthy for a woman in your situation to work herself to exhaustion." Sarah poured coffee from the pot that always simmered on the stove, trying to keep her movements casual despite the anxiety gnawing at her stomach. Swift Eagle was resting in Thomas's old office, just down the hall from where they sat, and his recovery had reached the point where he was moving around the room regularly. Any unexpected noise could give away his presence. "I'm managing well enough," Sarah replied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "The children are a great help, and we're keeping up with all the necessary work." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face creased into a frown as she studied her hostess more closely. "You seem nervous, child. Has something happened? We've heard reports of Comanche activity in the area, and I worry about you being out here alone with just the children for protection." The irony of the comment wasn't lost on Sarah, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. "We haven't had any trouble. The children and I stay close to the house, and Samuel's getting quite good with the rifle. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering the usual topics of crops, weather, and community gossip. Mrs. Henderson shared news from town, including reports that a cavalry patrol had engaged a Comanche raiding party somewhere to the south. Several Indians had been killed or wounded in the fight, though some had escaped into the wilderness. Sarah listened to this account with growing unease, realizing that the battle Mrs. Henderson described was almost certainly the one that had left Swift Eagle wounded and separated from his companions. The knowledge that she was harboring a participant in that raid made her acutely uncomfortable, though she tried not to let her feelings show. As Mrs. Henderson prepared to leave, she paused at the door and fixed Sarah with a penetrating stare. "You're sure everything is all right here? You seem different somehow, distracted. If you're having troubles, you know the community stands ready to help." Sarah assured her neighbor that all was well, but she could see that Mrs. Henderson remained unconvinced. The older woman had survived decades on the frontier by trusting her instincts, and those instincts were clearly telling her that something at the McKinnon homestead wasn't quite right. After Mrs. Henderson's departure, Sarah gathered her children for a serious discussion about the challenges they faced. Swift Eagle had overheard enough of the conversation to understand that their secret was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and he had begun talking about leaving despite the fact that his wounds weren't fully healed. "We can't keep this up much longer," Mary said, voicing what they were all thinking. Mrs. Henderson suspected something was wrong, and she's going to keep coming back until she figures out what it is. Samuel nodded in agreement. "And if word gets back to town that we've been hiding a Comanche warrior, they'll think we've gone crazy. Or worse, they might think we're working with his tribe against the settlements." The boys' concerns were well-founded. Frontier communities were tight-knit by necessity, and anyone perceived as a threat to collective security could quickly find themselves ostracized or even driven away. The fact that Sarah was a widow with children would provide little protection if the townspeople decided she had betrayed their trust. Swift Eagle, who had been listening from the doorway of his room, stepped into the kitchen with obvious reluctance. His movements were still somewhat stiff, but he had regained much of his strength and no longer looked like a man on the verge of death. "I must go," he said quietly, his English now noticeably improved after weeks of daily conversation with the family. "Too dangerous for you if I stay." Sarah looked at him with conflicted emotions. The practical part of her mind agreed that his departure would solve their immediate problems and restore normalcy to their lives. But another part of her, a part she didn't fully understand, felt genuine sadness at the prospect of his leaving. The conversations they had shared during his recovery had given her insights into a world she had never imagined, and his presence had somehow made the loneliness of widowhood more bearable. "Your wounds aren't completely healed," she protested. "The infection could return if you don't rest long enough for proper recovery." Swift Eagle shook his head. "I'm strong enough to travel. My people, they worry when warriors not return. If I stay longer, they come looking. That bring big trouble for you." The possibility of a Comanche search party arriving at their homestead sent chills down everyone's spine. While Swift Eagle had proven to be gentle and trustworthy, they had no guarantee that his fellow warriors would show the same restraint. A group of armed Comanche arriving to look for their missing companion could easily be mistaken for a raiding party by nervous settlers or cavalry patrols. But Swift Eagle's departure presented its own set of challenges. He had arrived on foot, badly wounded, and without supplies, weapons, or transportation. His horse had either been killed in the battle or had wandered off during his period of unconsciousness. Sending him back into the wilderness in his current condition would be little different from leaving him to die by the creek where they had found him. "You need a horse and supplies for the journey," Sarah pointed out. "It's at least a week's travel to reach your people, maybe more if you have to avoid patrols and settlements." The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of their situation. Providing Swift Eagle with a horse would require either purchasing one from town, which would raise questions about why a widow needed an extra mount, or giving him one of their own animals, which they could ill afford to lose. Supplies for his journey would have to be gathered carefully to avoid creating obvious gaps in their stores that might be noticed by visitors. Samuel suggested that they could claim their mare had wandered off or been stolen, which would explain its absence without raising suspicions about their involvement with Comanche warriors. The story would be believable, as horse theft was a common problem throughout the frontier, and their neighbors would be sympathetic rather than suspicious. Mary proposed that they could gradually accumulate travel supplies by taking slightly larger portions during their weekly shopping trips to town. Dried meat, hardtack, and other trail food could be purchased in small quantities over several weeks without creating obvious patterns that might draw attention. Even young Emma contributed to the planning, suggesting that her mother could claim to be preserving extra food for winter storage if anyone noticed their increased purchases. The girls' involvement in the deception showed how completely the family had committed to helping their unusual guest, despite the risks involved. Over the next few days, they began implementing their plan with careful attention to detail. Sarah made several trips to the general store in town, spreading her purchases across multiple visits and different times of day to avoid establishing patterns. She bought jerked beef, hardtack, dried corn, and other supplies that would keep well during travel, always providing plausible explanations for her purchases when asked. The process of selecting a horse for Swift Eagle proved more complicated. Their mare, Bessie, was their primary means of transportation and couldn't be spared without serious consequences for the family. Their plow horse, Duke, was too old and slow for the journey Swift Eagle would need to make. That left only Thomas's old riding horse, a spirited gelding named Thunder who had been largely unused since his master's death. Thunder was a fine animal, strong and fast enough to carry Swift Eagle safely to his destination, but parting with him would mean losing their last physical connection to Thomas. The horse had been her husband's pride and joy, carefully trained and lovingly cared for throughout their marriage. Sarah had avoided making the decision about what to do with Thunder since Thomas's death, but circumstances now forced her hand. The emotional weight of giving away Thomas's horse added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Sarah found herself wondering what her husband would think of her actions, whether he would approve of her helping a Comanche warrior or condemn her for what he might see as a betrayal of their community. These doubts were compounded by her children's mixed feelings about their father's horse. Samuel had been hoping to inherit Thunder when he grew older and stronger, dreaming of the day he could ride across the range like his father before him. Mary had fond memories of grooming the horse and feeding him apples from their small orchard. Even Emma had formed an attachment to the gentle giant who had sometimes carried her around the yard on quiet afternoons. Swift Eagle sensed the family's reluctance to part with the horse and offered to leave on foot, but Sarah knew that would likely be a death sentence. The distances involved in frontier travel were enormous, and a man alone without a horse will be vulnerable to everything from wild animals to hostile encounters with cavalry patrols or rival tribes. Thomas would want us to do the right thing, she finally decided, though her voice wavered with emotion. He was always generous with neighbors in need, and I don't think he would make an exception just because that neighbor happened to be Comanche. The decision to give Swift Eagle Thunder represented more than just practical problem-solving. It symbolized Sarah's complete commitment to helping the man who had unexpectedly entered their lives, regardless of the personal cost involved. The horse represented security, mobility, and emotional connection to her deceased husband, yet she was willing to sacrifice all of that for the welfare of someone her community would consider an enemy. Swift Eagle understood the magnitude of her gift and was visibly moved by her generosity. In Comanche culture, horses were symbols of wealth and status, and the gift of a fine horse carried enormous significance. He spent several minutes examining Thunder, running his hands over the animal's muscles and checking its teeth, and posed with the expertise of someone who had spent his entire life working with horses. "This good horse," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "I take care, treat with respect. Your husband, he chews well." The days that followed were filled with final preparations for Swift Eagle's departure. Sarah taught him basic phrases in English that might help him avoid confrontations with settlers or soldiers, while he shared knowledge about wilderness survival that could benefit her family in the future. The cultural exchange that had begun during his recovery deepened during these final days, creating bonds of understanding that transcended the racial and political divisions of their time. Samuel spent hours with Swift Eagle learning about Comanche hunting techniques and horse training methods. The boy was fascinated by the warrior's descriptions of buffalo hunts and the complex social structure of tribal life. These conversations gave Samuel a perspective on the frontier conflicts that differed dramatically from the one-sided accounts he had heard in town. Mary was drawn to Swift Eagle's stories about Comanche women and their roles in tribal society. She learned about the intricate beadwork and quill work that decorated clothing and ceremonial items, the important economic functions performed by women in nomadic society, and the respect accorded to skilled craftswomen within the tribe. Even Emma overcame her initial fear enough to listen to Swift Eagle's tales of Comanche children and their daily lives. She was particularly fascinated by his descriptions of the games children played and the ceremonies that marked important transitions in their young lives. These stories helped her understand that Comanche children were much like herself, despite their different upbringing and cultural background. The conversations also revealed the depth of Swift Eagle's own losses and struggles. He spoke quietly about relatives killed in conflicts with settlers, hunting grounds lost to advancing civilization, and the constant uncertainty that marked life for his people. His words helped Sarah understand that the raids and attacks that terrorized frontier communities were not acts of random violence, but desperate attempts by displaced people to maintain their traditional way of life. This understanding didn't excuse or justify the violence that had claimed so many innocent lives on both sides of the conflict, but it provided context that complicated the simple narrative of good versus evil that had shaped Sarah's previous understanding of the frontier wars. Swift Eagle was neither a savage nor a saint, but a complex individual caught in circumstances beyond his control, doing what he believed necessary to protect his people and preserve their future. As the date of his departure approached, Swift Eagle made a request that surprised everyone. He asked Sarah to allow him to teach Samuel and Mary some basic Comanche words and phrases, arguing that knowledge of the language might someday prove useful in avoiding conflicts or misunderstandings. Sarah hesitated, knowing that her children's knowledge of Comanche could raise suspicions if discovered by their neighbors. But she also recognized the wisdom in Swift Eagle's suggestion. The frontier was changing rapidly, and the ability to communicate with different peoples could prove valuable in unexpected ways. The language lessons that followed provided another opportunity for cultural exchange and deeper understanding. Swift Eagle was patient and encouraging as the children struggled with unfamiliar sounds and concepts. He explained not just the words themselves, but the cultural context that gave them meaning, helping his students understand how language reflected the values and worldview of its speakers. For Sarah, listening to her children learn words in Comanche was both touching and troubling. She was proud of their open-mindedness and willingness to embrace new knowledge, but worried about how this experience would affect their relationships with their peers and neighbors in the years to come. Would they be able to return to the simpler worldview that had shaped their early childhood, or would their understanding of the Comanche perspective forever complicate their place in frontier society? The question became more pressing when Mrs. Henderson made another unexpected visit, arriving just as one of the language lessons was concluding. The children managed to compose themselves quickly, but Sarah could see suspicion flickering in their neighbor's sharp eyes as she noted the family's obvious nervousness and the haste with which they had ended their mysterious activity. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone suggesting that she hoped quite the opposite. Sarah forced another smile. "Just helping the children with their reading. We were practicing some difficult words." The excuse was weak, and Sarah could see that Mrs. Henderson didn't believe it. The older woman's gaze swept the room, noting details that might provide clues about what the McKinnon family was really doing. Her eyes lingered on the extra bedding visible through the open door of Thomas's old office, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that their secret was on the verge of discovery. The visit seemed to last forever, with Mrs. Henderson asking pointed questions about the family's activities and commenting on changes she had noticed in their behavior. She mentioned seeing unusual horse tracks around the property during a previous visit, and wondered aloud about the source of the strange cooking smells she had detected near the house. Each observation chipped away at Sarah's carefully constructed cover story, and she found herself struggling to provide explanations that would satisfy her neighbor's curiosity without revealing the truth. The children remained largely silent during the visit, clearly afraid that anything they said might accidentally give away their secret. Swift Eagle, meanwhile, remained hidden in the office, undoubtedly hearing every word of the conversation and understanding the danger his presence posed to the family that had saved his life. Sarah could only imagine what he must be feeling as he listened to the suspicions and accusations that his very existence had created. When Mrs. Henderson finally left, her parting words carried an unmistakable warning. You know, Sarah, if something unusual was happening here, something that might affect the safety of the community, I'm sure you would share that information with your neighbors. We all depend on each other out here, and secrets can be dangerous things. The message was clear. Mrs. Henderson suspected that the McKinnon family was hiding something significant, and she was prepared to take action if her suspicions were confirmed. The comfortable isolation that had allowed them to care for Swift Eagle in secret was rapidly disappearing, replaced by the unwelcome attention of a community that valued conformity and viewed deviation from accepted norms as a potential threat to collective survival. That evening, as the family gathered for what they all knew would be Swift Eagle's last night in their home, the weight of their situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. They had managed to save a man's life and bridge cultural divides that most people considered unbridgeable, but the cost of their compassion was becoming increasingly clear. The outside world was closing in on their secret, and tomorrow would bring decisions that none of them were prepared to make. Swift Eagle would leave, taking with him the knowledge and understanding that had enriched their lives during his stay. But his departure would not erase the changes his presence had wrought in their hearts and minds, changes that would follow them long after his horse had disappeared over the horizon. Dawn broke gray and overcast on the morning of Swift Eagle's planned departure, as if the sky itself reflected the somber mood that had settled over the McKinnon homestead. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning with worries about the dangerous journey that lay ahead for the man who had become more friend than patient during his weeks of recovery. Swift Eagle had risen before first light to prepare Thunder for travel, checking the horse's shoes and adjusting the saddle that Samuel had retrieved from a barn. The sight of him mounted on Thomas's horse stirred complex emotions in Sarah's heart. In his Comanche clothing, with his long hair braided for travel and his wounds finally healed enough for hard riding, he looked every inch the fierce warrior that frontier legends described. Yet she knew him now as something far more complex than those simple characterizations allowed. The travel supplies they had carefully accumulated were packed in saddlebags that Mary had sewn from old blankets, designed to look like standard frontier gear rather than anything that might identify the rider as Indian. Swift Eagle had reluctantly agreed to carry one of Thomas's old shirts and a spare hat, items that might help him blend in from a distance if he encountered other travelers on the trail. The family gathered in the yard to say their farewells, each struggling with emotions they couldn't quite name. Swift Eagle had become part of their daily routine, his presence filling some of the emptiness that Thomas's death had left in their lives. His departure would restore their safety and normalcy, but it would also leave them somehow diminished. Samuel approached the mounted warrior with obvious reluctance, carrying the rifle that had belonged to his father. Swift Eagle, he said carefully, using the English version of the name they had assigned to their guest. Pa would want you to have this, for protection on the trail. The offer was both generous and dangerous. Giving a rifle to a Comanche warrior could be seen as an act of treason if discovered, providing weapons that might be used against other frontier families. Yet Samuel's instincts were sound. Swift Eagle would face numerous dangers during his journey home, and traveling unarmed through hostile territory was essentially a death sentence. Swift Eagle studied the boy's face for a long moment before dismounting and placing his hands on Samuel's shoulders. "You keep rifle," he said firmly. "Your family need protection more than Swift Eagle. I know this land, know how to travel safe without gun." The rejection of the weapon was itself a gift, demonstrating Swift Eagle's concern for the family's welfare above his own safety. But his next action surprised everyone. From his saddlebags, he retrieved a beautifully crafted knife in a decorated sheath, its handle carved with intricate designs that spoke of hours of patient work. "For Samuel," he said, offering the knife to the boy, "made by Swift Eagle's hands during long winter nights. You remember friendship between peoples when you see this." Samuel accepted the knife with reverence, understanding that he was receiving not just a tool, but a symbol of the bond that had formed between them. The weapon was clearly of Comanche manufacture, its design and decoration unmistakably Indian, which meant that possessing it would require careful concealment. But the boy seemed to understand the significance of the gift and the trust it represented. Mary stepped forward next, carrying a small bundle wrapped in clean cloth. "These are biscuits and honey cakes for your journey," she said, her voice unsteady with emotion. "And this," she handed him a small piece of beadwork she had attempted, trying to copy the patterns she had admired on his clothing. The work was clearly that of a beginner, but the effort and thought behind it made it precious. Swift Eagle examined the beadwork with the same careful attention he had given Samuel's rifle, nodding approvingly at Mary's attempts to master techniques that Comanche women spent years perfecting. "Very good work," he pronounced solemnly. "Mary has good hands for this art. In my village, women would teach her more, show her old patterns from grandmothers." Even young Emma had prepared a farewell gift, presenting Swift Eagle with a small bouquet of wildflowers tied with a ribbon from her hair. The gesture was simple but profound, representing the complete transformation of a child who had once hidden in terror behind her sister's skirts whenever the warrior appeared. Sarah's own farewell was the most difficult. She had prepared a packet of medical supplies and written instructions for wound care, knowing that infection and injury were constant threats for anyone traveling alone through the wilderness. But she struggled to find words that could adequately express what his presence had meant to her and her family. "You gave us more than we gave you," she finally managed to say. "We'll remember what we learned about your people, about seeing beyond appearances to the person underneath." Swift Eagle's response was equally heartfelt. Sarah McKinnon saved more than Swift Eagle's life, showed that peace possible between peoples if hearts are open. Swift Eagle never forget kindness of this family. The moment of parting had arrived, but before Swift Eagle could remount Thunder, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the emotional quiet of their farewells. A group of riders was approaching from the direction of town, moving at the steady pace that suggested official business rather than casual visitation. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Coleman, accompanied by 2 deputies and Mrs. Henderson. The older woman, suspicious, had evidently prompted an official investigation, and their arrival at this particular moment could hardly have been worse timed. "Get inside, quickly," Sarah hissed to Swift Eagle, but it was too late for concealment. The riders were already close enough to have seen him clearly, and any attempt to hide would only confirm their suspicions. Sheriff Coleman was a fair man by frontier standards, but he was also responsible for the safety of the entire community. His weathered face was grim as he rode into the yard, his eyes fixed on the Comanche warrior who stood beside Thunder with obvious preparation for travel. "Morning, Mrs. McKinnon," Coleman said carefully, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "Mrs. Henderson here tells me you might have something to report to the authorities." Mrs. Henderson's expression mixed vindication with genuine concern as she looked between Sarah and Swift Eagle. "I knew something wasn't right," she said. "Sarah, how could you put the entire community at risk by harboring a hostile Indian? What if his tribe comes looking for him?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a prairie fire, carrying the potential to destroy everything the McKinnon family had built in the community. Sarah felt the weight of multiple gazes upon her, measuring her response and waiting to see whether she would defend or denounce the man who had shared their home for weeks. "He's not hostile," she said quietly, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt. "He was wounded and dying when we found him. We couldn't just leave him to die." Deputy Marshal Tucker, a young man Sarah recognized from church services, looked incredulous. "Ma'am, this is a Comanche warrior. These are the people who've been raiding homesteads and killing families throughout the territory. You can't just assume one of them is harmless because he was injured." The second deputy, an older man named Williams, was studying Swift Eagle with the wary attention of someone who had seen too much frontier violence. "What's your name, Indian?" he demanded. "What tribe? What were you doing on this property?" Swift Eagle straightened to his full height, meeting the deputy's hostile gaze without flinching. His English had improved dramatically during his stay with the family, but Sarah could see him choosing his words carefully to avoid misunderstandings that could prove fatal. "I'm called Swift Eagle," he said with quiet dignity. "I am Comanche, of the band led by Chief Running Bear. I was wounded in battle, lost my way, found help with this family." Sheriff Coleman leaned forward in his saddle, his expression growing more serious. "That battle with the cavalry patrol 2 weeks ago, you were part of that raiding party." The admission that Swift Eagle had indeed participated in the raid that Mrs. Henderson had described sent a ripple of tension through the group. Even Sarah felt a chill at the confirmation of what she had suspected, but tried not to think about too deeply. "My people fight for survival," Swift Eagle replied, his tone remaining steady despite the obviously dangerous turn the conversation had taken. "White settlers take our hunting grounds, kill our buffalo, drive us from lands our fathers owned. We fight to protect our children's future. Deputy Williams snorted with derision. Protect your children by murdering innocent families? You people are nothing but savages, and anyone who helps you is a traitor to their own kind. The harsh words stung Sarah more than she expected, carrying as they did the implicit condemnation of the entire community. She could see the same judgment in Mrs. Henderson's eyes, the conviction that her actions had been not just foolish but actively treacherous. But Samuel stepped forward boldly, his young face set with determination that reminded Sarah painfully of his father. "Swift Eagle never hurt us," the boy declared. "He's been staying here for weeks, and he could have killed us all if that's what he wanted. Instead, he taught us things about his people, helped us understand why they fight." Mary nodded in support of her brother. "He told us about his wife and children, about his village and their customs. He's not a savage. He's just a man trying to protect his family, the same way Pa would have protected us." Sheriff Coleman studied the children's faces, clearly troubled by their obvious affection for the Comanche warrior. "That may be so," he said slowly, "but the law is clear about harboring hostile Indians. Mrs. McKinnon, you've put yourself and your children in serious legal jeopardy." The legal implications of her actions hadn't fully occurred to Sarah until that moment. She had been so focused on the medical and moral aspects of helping Swift Eagle that she hadn't considered the criminal charges that might result from her decision. The frontier operated under martial law in many respects, and collaboration with hostile Indians was a serious offense that could result in imprisonment or worse. Mrs. Henderson seemed to realize that her report might have consequences beyond what she had intended. "Sarah, I didn't mean to get you in trouble with the law," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I was just worried about the safety of the community." Swift Eagle spoke up before Sarah could respond. "This woman and her children did nothing wrong. They found Injure Man, gave help as Christian people should. If punishment comes, it should fall on Swift Eagle alone." His willingness to accept responsibility for the situation touched Sarah deeply, but she knew that protecting him was her decision, not something that had been forced upon her. Whatever consequences resulted from her actions, she would face them as the deliberate choices of an adult woman, not the victim of circumstances beyond her control. Sheriff Coleman dismounted and approached Swift Eagle directly, his experienced eyes taking in details that might prove important later. "You're looking pretty healthy for someone who is supposedly dying," he observed. "And that's a fine horse you're riding. Where did you get it?" The question about thunder struck at the heart of Sarah's sacrifices for Swift Eagle's welfare. Admitting that she had given him her deceased husband's horse would provide additional evidence of the depth of her collaboration with a hostile Indian, potentially making her legal situation even more precarious. "The horse was a gift," Swift Eagle said carefully. "Payment for medical care received." It was technically true, though it hardly captured the emotional significance of Sarah's decision to give him thunder. But the simple statement seemed to satisfy the sheriff's immediate curiosity while avoiding details that might complicate the situation further. Deputy Williams was growing impatient with what he saw as pointless conversation. "Sheriff, we should arrest both of them and let the territorial court sort this out. The woman for harboring a hostile, the Indian for participating in raids against American citizens." The suggestion of arrest galvanized the children into action. Emma burst into tears, while Samuel and Mary moved protectively closer to their mother. The sight of the frightened children seemed to affect Sheriff Coleman, whose own family included youngsters of similar ages. "Let's not be hasty," Coleman said, though his tone remained serious. "Mrs. McKinnon, I need you to understand the gravity of this situation. Harboring hostile Indians is a federal offense, and there are people in the territorial government who would see you hanged for what you've done." The blunt statement of potential consequences sent a shock through Sarah that was almost physical in its intensity. She had known that her actions carried risks, but the possibility of execution for showing Christian mercy seemed impossibly harsh. Swift Eagle stepped forward, his posture suggesting he was prepared to fight if necessary to protect the family that had saved him. "If harm comes to this woman or her children because of Swift Eagle, then honor demands that I defend them. These people showed mercy when they could have shown hatred. Swift Eagle will not forget debt owed." The declaration of loyalty from a Comanche warrior to a white frontier family was so unusual that it left the law enforcement officers momentarily speechless. Mrs. Henderson looked genuinely shocked, her assumptions about savage Indians clearly challenged by Swift Eagle's obvious devotion to the McKinnon family. Sheriff Coleman studied the scene before him with the careful attention of a man trying to balance competing obligations. His duty to the law demanded that he arrest both Sarah and Swift Eagle, but his personal understanding of frontier life made him sympathetic to the impossible choices that people sometimes faced in desperate situations. "Here's what we're going to do," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Mrs. McKinnon, you and your children are going to come into town with us for questioning by the territorial authorities. The Indian is going to surrender himself to federal custody for participation in hostile actions against American settlers." The proposed solution satisfied no one. Sarah would face serious charges that could result in her imprisonment and the scattering of her children to distant relatives or orphanages. Swift Eagle would almost certainly be executed as a participant in raids against civilian targets. The family that had formed such strong bonds during his recovery would be destroyed by the very legal system they had hoped to navigate successfully. But Mrs. Henderson surprised everyone by speaking up on Sarah's behalf. "Sheriff Coleman, I may have been hasty in my report," she said slowly. "After seeing how that Indian behaves toward the children, I'm starting to wonder if maybe Sarah was right to help him. Maybe showing mercy isn't always the wrong thing to do." The older woman's change of heart didn't solve their legal problems, but it demonstrated the power of witnessing genuine human connection across racial and cultural boundaries. Even someone as set in her ways as Mrs. Henderson could be moved by evidence of decency and compassion. Deputy Williams remained unconvinced by the display of mutual loyalty he was witnessing. "Sheriff, we can't let sentiment cloud our judgment here. The law exists for good reasons, and making exceptions just encourages more lawless behavior." The tension in the yard was palpable as Sheriff Coleman considered his options. He had the authority to make arrests, but he also had discretion in how he handled situations that didn't fit neatly into legal categories. The case before him involved genuine human complexity that couldn't be easily resolved by simple application of written statutes. Swift Eagle made the decision for everyone by swinging up on a thunder's back with fluid grace. "Swift Eagle will not bring more trouble to this family," he announced. "Debt is paid, friendship remembered always." Now Swift Eagle returns to his people before more harm comes to those who showed kindness. His intention to leave immediately was clear, but Sheriff Coleman raised his hand in a gesture that stopped the warrior before he could urge thunder into motion. "Hold on there," Coleman said. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. There are federal authorities involved now, and they're going to want answers about the raids and casualties from that cavalry engagement. You can't just ride away like nothing happened." The standoff that followed would determine the fate of everyone present. Swift Eagle sat motionless on thunder, clearly prepared to fight or flee if necessary to avoid capture. Sarah stood with her children, knowing that the next few minutes would define the rest of their lives. The law enforcement officers faced a situation that had no good solutions, only choices between different types of tragedy. What happened next would test the bonds of friendship that had formed between the Comanche warrior and the frontier family, forcing everyone involved to choose between personal loyalty and social obligation, between human compassion and legal duty, between the easy path of conformity and the dangerous road of standing up for what they believed was right. The standoff in the McKinnon yard stretched taut as a bowstring, with everyone frozen in positions that would define their futures. Sheriff Coleman's hand hovered near his weapon while his mind raced through the limited options available to him. Swift Eagle sat perfectly still atop thunder, but Sarah could see the subtle shift in his posture that indicated he was preparing for sudden action. The children huddled close to their mother, sensing that adult decisions were being made that would affect them profoundly. It was Mrs. Henderson who unexpectedly broke the deadlock. "Sheriff Coleman," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 40 years on the frontier. "What if we never saw this Indian at all?" The suggestion hung in the air like morning mist, carrying implications that made everyone reconsider their positions. Coleman studied the older woman's face, trying to determine whether her proposal was genuine or simply an attempt to complicate an already difficult situation. "Mrs. Henderson," Coleman said carefully, "are you suggesting that we allow a known participant in hostile actions to simply disappear? The territorial authorities are expecting a full report on this matter." Mrs. Henderson straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. I'm suggesting that maybe my suspicions were wrong. Maybe I imagined things that weren't there. Got myself worked up over nothing more than Sarah's natural nervousness about living alone with her children. Deputy Williams looked incredulous. Ma'am, we're all standing here looking at a Comanche warrior on horseback. There's no imagining involved. But Mrs. Henderson had clearly made up her mind about something important. Are we? She asked pointedly. I see Sarah McKinnon and her children, same as always. I see you boys doing your jobs, checking up on isolated homesteads like good lawmen should. But I don't see any Indians here, hostile or otherwise. The older woman's deliberate blindness to Swift Eagle's presence created a strange kind of legal fiction that could potentially solve everyone's problems. If no Comanche warrior had ever been at the McKinnon homestead, then no laws had been broken and no reports needed to be filed with territorial authorities. Sheriff Coleman understood the subtext of Mrs. Henderson's statement, but accepting her version of events would require him to ignore obvious evidence and file a false report with his superiors. Such actions could end his career and potentially result in criminal charges against him personally. Sarah found her voice during the long pause that followed. Sheriff Coleman, Mrs. Henderson is right that she might have misunderstood what she saw during her visits. The frontier can play tricks on people's minds, make them see threats where none exist. The carefully phrased statement gave Coleman additional room to maneuver while maintaining plausible deniability about the true situation. If Sarah herself was saying that Mrs. Henderson had been mistaken, then perhaps there really was nothing to report to higher authorities. But Deputy Williams wasn't willing to participate in what he saw as an obvious deception. This is crazy, he protested. We're all looking at clear evidence of lawbreaking, and now everyone wants to pretend it never happened. Swift Eagle spoke for the first time since announcing his intention to leave. Deputy speaks truth. Swift Eagle is here. Swift Eagle did fight cavalry. Cannot change what happened by saying it did not happen. His insistence on honesty, even when it worked against his own interests, impressed everyone present and added another layer of complexity to their moral calculations. Here was a man who could have escaped through deception, but chose instead to accept responsibility for his actions, regardless of the consequences. Sheriff Coleman found himself facing a decision that would haunt him regardless of what he chose. Following the letter of the law would mean destroying a family that had shown extraordinary compassion and executing a man whose only crimes were fighting for his people's survival. But ignoring obvious lawbreaking would mean betraying his oath of office and potentially endangering the community he was sworn to protect. The children watched the adults struggle with their impossible choices, not fully understanding the legal complexities, but clearly grasping that their family's future hung in the balance. Emma had stopped crying and now clung silently to Mary's hand, while Samuel stood protectively near his mother with a maturity that spoke of harsh lessons learned too early. It was Samuel who provided the next unexpected intervention. Sheriff Coleman, he said, his young voice steady despite his obvious fear. What if Swift Eagle wasn't really part of that raiding party? What if he was just traveling alone and got caught up in the fighting by accident? The boy's suggestion offered another potential avenue for resolving their dilemma. If Swift Eagle could be classified as an innocent victim rather than a hostile participant, it might justify both his presence at the homestead and the family's decision to help him. Sheriff Coleman studied the Comanche warrior's face, looking for any sign that he might be willing to accept this alternative version of events. But Swift Eagle's expression remained stoic, giving no indication of his thoughts about the various escape routes being offered to him. It's an interesting theory, Coleman said slowly, but it would need to be supported by evidence. Can you prove that you weren't voluntarily participating in hostile actions against American settlers? The question put Swift Eagle in an impossible position. Denying his role in the raid would be dishonest, but admitting to it would confirm his status as a hostile combatant subject to military justice. His personal code of honor seemed to prohibit the kind of deception that might save his life. But Sarah stepped forward with surprising confidence. Sheriff, I've been caring for this man's wounds for weeks. The injuries he sustained are consistent with someone who was caught in crossfire rather than someone who was actively fighting. The bullet wound came from behind, and the arrow wound suggests he was trying to escape rather than engage. Her medical assessment was creative rather than strictly accurate, but it provided a plausible alternative explanation for Swift Eagle's injuries that could support the theory of accidental involvement. Coleman found himself impressed by her quick thinking and willingness to take risks to protect someone she cared about. Deputy Williams remained skeptical of the rapidly evolving story. Even if that were true, which I doubt, harboring any Indian without reporting it to authorities is still illegal. Mrs. McKinnon knew she should have sent word to town as soon as she found him. The deputy's point was legally sound, and Sarah had no good answer for it. She had indeed violated territorial law by failing to report Swift Eagle's presence, regardless of the circumstances that brought him to their property. Mrs. Henderson came to Sarah's defense once again. "Williams, you're a young man who doesn't understand how things work out here. When someone is dying on your doorstep, you don't waste time riding to town for permission to save their life. You do what needs to be done and worry about paperwork later." The older woman's pragmatic frontier philosophy resonated with Sheriff Coleman, who had seen enough emergencies to understand that survival often required rapid decisions made without the luxury of consulting legal authorities. The harsh realities of wilderness life sometimes conflicted with the neat categories of territorial law. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Swift Eagle was undeniably present, undeniably Comanche, and undeniably someone who had been involved in recent conflicts with American forces. No amount of creative interpretation could completely eliminate the legal implications of those facts. Swift Eagle himself recognized the impossibility of the situation and made a decision that surprised everyone. He dismounted from Thunder and walked slowly towards Sheriff Coleman, his hands held away from his body to show that he posed no threat. "Swift Eagle surrenders to law," he announced solemnly. "Will not bring more trouble to family that showed kindness. Will accept punishment for actions taken to protect Swift Eagle's people." His willingness to sacrifice himself to protect the McKinnon family demonstrated a nobility of character that challenged every stereotype about savage Indians that the frontier community had embraced. Here was a man choosing certain death to spare others the consequences of their compassion toward him. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes as she watched Swift Eagle prepare to accept custody. The decision she had made weeks earlier to save a dying man had evolved into something far more complex than simple medical charity. She had helped save not just a life, but had discovered a friend whose character transcended the racial and cultural boundaries that supposedly made such friendships impossible. But she wasn't prepared to let him sacrifice himself for her family's welfare. "No," she said firmly, stepping between Swift Eagle and the sheriff. "I made the choice to help him, and I'll accept responsibility for the consequences. If laws were broken, I broke them knowingly and deliberately." Her declaration of responsibility created yet another complication for Sheriff Coleman. Arresting Sarah would mean leaving 3 children without their only remaining parent, essentially destroying the family to uphold legal principles that seemed increasingly meaningless in the context of a human drama unfolding before him. Mary and Samuel immediately joined their mother in facing the authorities, their young faces set with determination that revealed the depth of their commitment to protecting Swift Eagle. Even Emma, despite her age and obvious fear, moved to stand with her family rather than seeking safety through distance from the controversy. The sight of an entire family willing to face legal consequences rather than abandon someone they cared about moved Mrs. Henderson to tears. "Sheriff," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "these people have shown more Christian charity than anyone in our community. How can we punish them for living up to the values we claim to hold dear?" Deputy Williams looked around the group with growing frustration. "Are you all crazy? Laws exist for good reasons. If we start ignoring them whenever we feel sorry for someone, we'll have chaos instead of civilization." His argument had merit from a purely legal standpoint, but it ignored the human complexities that made simple application of written statutes sometimes feel more like injustice than law enforcement. Coleman found himself caught between competing obligations that seemed impossible to reconcile. The deadlock was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, this time from a different direction. A lone rider was coming from the east, moving at the steady pace of someone on official business. As the figure drew closer, Coleman recognized Captain Mitchell of the Territorial Cavalry, whose presence could only mean that word of the situation had already reached higher authorities. Captain Mitchell rode into the yard with the bearing of a professional soldier accustomed to dealing with frontier complexities. His uniform was dusty from hard riding, and his face showed the strain of someone who had been traveling with urgent purpose. "Sheriff Coleman," Mitchell said as he dismounted, I received word that you might have located one of the Comanche raiders who escaped from our recent engagement. The territorial governor is very interested in questioning survivors about the location of hostile camps and future planned activities. The captain's arrival changed the entire dynamic of their situation. This was no longer a local matter that could be resolved through creative interpretation of events, but a military issue that involved territorial security and federal authority. Coleman's discretion in handling the matter had suddenly become much more limited. Swift Eagle straightened to his full height as Captain Mitchell approached, showing no fear despite the obvious implications of military involvement in his case. The warrior's dignity in the face of almost certain execution impressed even the hardened cavalry officer who had fought against Comanche forces on numerous occasions. "So this is our missing raider," Mitchell said, studying Swift Eagle with professional interest. "He doesn't look like much now, but these Comanche warriors can be deceiving. Some of the fiercest fighters on the frontier appear quite civilized when they're not actively trying to kill you." Sarah felt compelled to defend Swift Eagle against the captain's casual dismissal of his character. "Captain Mitchell, this man has been recovering from serious wounds for weeks. During that time, he's shown nothing but kindness and respect toward my family. Whatever he may have done in the past, he's not the savage monster that people make Comanche warriors out to be." Mitchell's eyebrows rose at Sarah's spirited defense of a hostile Indian. "Mrs. McKinnon, I take it I have to admire your charitable spirit, but you may be allowing sentiment to cloud your judgment about the true nature of the enemy we're facing." The captain's patronizing tone rankled, but Sarah forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not allowing anything to cloud my judgment, Captain. I'm telling you what I've observed during extended contact with this man. He's intelligent, honorable, and devoted to his family. The only reason he fights is to protect his people from destruction." Captain Mitchell seemed genuinely surprised by Sarah's sophisticated understanding of Comanche motivations. "That's an unusually nuanced perspective for a frontier settler," he observed. "Most families who've dealt with Indian raids have quite different opinions about their character and motivations." Swift Eagle spoke up before Sarah could respond. "Captain, Sarah McKinnon speaks truth about Swift Eagle's heart, but also truth that Swift Eagle fought against soldiers. Will not lie to save life. Honor more important than breath." The warrior's continued insistence on honesty, even when it worked against his interests, clearly impressed Captain Mitchell. "An interesting attitude," the officer mused. "Most prisoners try to minimize their involvement in hostile activities." Mrs. Henderson had been listening to the conversation with growing agitation, and, finally, couldn't contain herself any longer. "Captain Mitchell, this whole situation started because I reported suspicious activity to Sheriff Coleman. But after seeing how this Indian treats Sarah's children, I'm beginning to think I made a terrible mistake." Mitchell turned his attention to the older woman. "How so, Mrs. Henderson?" "Well, Mrs. Henderson said, clearly struggling with her emotions, I expected to find evidence of savage behavior, threats to innocent children, all the terrible things we hear about Indian raiders. Instead, I found a man who's obviously devoted to protecting this family, who's taught the children about his culture, who's been nothing but respectful and grateful for the care he received." The captain listened to Mrs. Henderson's revised assessment with obvious skepticism. "Mrs. Henderson, you may be witnessing an elaborate deception. Comanche warriors are known for their intelligence and cunning. It's possible that this man has been manipulating the family's sympathies as part of some larger plan." But Samuel stepped forward boldly to challenge the captain's cynical interpretation. "Sir, Swift Eagle had plenty of chances to hurt us if that's what he wanted. He's been getting stronger every day, and we're just a woman and 3 children. If he was planning something bad, why would he wait until now?" Mary nodded in support of her brother's logic. "And he taught us words in his language, told us about his wife and children, shared stories about his people's customs. Why would he bother with all that if he was just planning to hurt us?" Even young Emma found her voice to defend Swift Eagle. "He was always nice to me," she said in her small, clear voice. "He never scared me after the first day, and he always said thank you when Mama brought him food." The children's testimony created a compelling picture of extended, peaceful contact that contradicted Captain Mitchell's theories about deception and manipulation. It was difficult to argue that a man planning violence against a family would invest weeks in building genuine relationships with the children. Sheriff Coleman had been watching the exchange with growing certainty about what he needed to do. "Captain Mitchell," he said, I think we need to consider the possibility that this situation is more complex than it initially appeared. This man may have been involved in hostile activities, but his behavior since then suggests that he poses no current threat to the community. Mitchell frowned at the sheriff's suggestion. Sheriff Coleman, military policy regarding capture hostile Indians is quite clear. This man needs to be transported to territorial headquarters for interrogation and trial. The statement of official policy left little room for negotiation, but Sarah wasn't ready to give up without a fight. Captain, what if Swift Eagle could provide information about preventing future conflicts? What if his knowledge could help save lives on both sides? It was a desperate gambit, but Mitchell's expression suggested that the idea had merit. What kind of information are you suggesting he might provide? Sarah looked at Swift Eagle, hoping he would understand what she was trying to accomplish. Information about his people's movements, their concerns, what it would take to establish peace between the tribes and the settlements. Swift Eagle studied Sarah's face for a moment, then addressed Captain Mitchell directly. Swift Eagle can speak of many things. Location of villages, names of chiefs, reasons for fighting. But will speak only if promise made that no harm comes to this family for showing kindness to wounded enemy. The offer put Captain Mitchell in an interesting position. Information about Comanche movements and leadership could be extremely valuable for military planning and potentially save many lives in future conflicts. But accepting the offer would mean legitimizing the family's decision to harbor a hostile Indian, setting a precedent that could complicate future law enforcement efforts. The negotiations that followed would determine whether compassion and understanding could triumph over rigid adherence to policies that ignored human complexity. Everyone present understood that the decisions made in the next few minutes would echo far beyond the McKinnon homestead, potentially affecting the relationship between two peoples locked in a seemingly endless cycle of violence and misunderstanding. Captain Mitchell studied Swift Eagle's proposal with the careful attention of a military officer weighing tactical advantages against policy complications. The information that a Comanche warrior could provide about tribal movements and leadership structures was undeniably valuable, potentially worth more than the symbolic victory of executing one captured raider. But accepting the deal would require him to make decisions that exceeded his authority and could jeopardize his own career. What kind of guarantee are you offering about future peaceful behavior? Mitchell asked Swift Eagle directly. How do we know this isn't just a clever way to escape justice and return to raiding activities? Swift Eagle considered the question carefully before responding. Captain, Swift Eagle gives word of honor that no harm will come to any settlement from Swift Eagle's hand if this family is protected. More than this, we'll carry message to Chief Running Bear about peace talks between peoples. The offer was more substantial than Mitchell had expected. The possibility of opening communication channels with Comanche leadership represented a potential breakthrough that could save countless lives on both sides of the ongoing conflict. But it also required him to trust a man who had recently been fighting against American forces. Sarah sensed the captain's uncertainty and pressed their advantage. Captain Mitchell, this could be an opportunity to try something different. The cycle of raids and retaliation hasn't made anyone safer. Maybe it's time to see if understanding can accomplish what violence hasn't been able to achieve. Mrs. Henderson surprised everyone by adding her voice to the argument for clemency. Captain, I've lived on this frontier for more years than I care to count, and I've seen nothing but suffering come from the way we've been handling Indian conflicts. Maybe Sarah's approach deserves a chance. But Deputy Williams remained unconvinced by the arguments for exceptional treatment. Captain, with all due respect, this sets a dangerous precedent. If word gets out that we're making deals with hostile Indians, every raider captured in the future will expect the same consideration. The deputy's concerns reflected the broader challenges of frontier justice, where consistency and deterrence were considered essential for maintaining order. Making exceptions for sympathetic cases could undermine the authority structure that kept fragile communities together in the face of constant threats. Sheriff Coleman found himself in the unusual position of mediating between military authority and local discretion. Captain Mitchell, Mrs. McKinnon, and her family are respected members of our community. Their judgment about this man's character carries weight with me. Mitchell turned his attention to the children, studying their faces with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read people's true feelings. You children aren't afraid of this warrior at all, are you? Samuel answered for all of them. No, sir. Swift Eagle told us stories about his people and taught us words in his language. He's different from what people in town say Comanche warriors are like. Mary nodded enthusiastically. He helped me understand that his people have families and homes and worries just like we do. They're not monsters, Captain Mitchell. They're just people trying to survive in a world that's changing too fast. Even Emma, despite her young age, contributed to their defense of Swift Eagle. He always said please and thank you, and he never raised his voice or acted mean even when his wounds hurt him badly. Captain Mitchell was clearly moved by the children's testimony, but military duty warred with personal sympathy in his expression. These are compelling character references, he admitted, but military policy exists for good reasons. I can't simply ignore my orders because a prisoner has shown good behavior during his recovery. Swift Eagle stepped forward with a dignity that had impressed everyone who had encountered him. Captain, Swift Eagle understands duty to law and to people. Will accept whatever punishment decided. But ask one thing, let this family live in peace. They did only what their hearts told them was right. The warrior's willingness to accept responsibility while protecting others demonstrated a nobility that challenged every assumption the frontier community held about Indian character. Here was a man facing execution who was more concerned about the welfare of his captors than his own survival. Sarah couldn't remain silent while Swift Eagle prepared to sacrifice himself for her family's protection. Captain Mitchell, if you're determined to punish someone for the choices that were made here, then punish me. I'm the one who decided to help him, and I'm the one who should face the consequences. Her declaration triggered immediate protest from her children, who had no intention of allowing their mother to sacrifice herself for their sake. The scene of a family united in their willingness to protect each other and their determination to extend that same protection to a former enemy created a powerful emotional impact that even the hardened military officer couldn't ignore. Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the drama unfold. Captain, I've never seen anything like this in all my years on the frontier. This Indian warrior and this pioneer family have found a way to see past hatred and fear to the human beings underneath. Maybe that's the kind of miracle we need more of out here. Captain Mitchell found himself facing a decision that would define not just the fate of the people before him, but potentially the direction of future relations between settlers and Indian tribes. The standard military approach of punitive justice had failed to bring peace to the frontier. Perhaps it was time to try something different. Mrs. McKinnon, he said finally, you're asking me to risk my career on the belief that this one man can bridge the gap between two peoples who have been at war for decades. Sarah met his gaze steadily. I'm asking you to risk your career on the belief that human decency can triumph over prejudice and fear. That understanding can succeed where violence has failed. That mercy is sometimes stronger than justice. The captain studied each face in turn, measuring the depth of commitment he saw there. These weren't naive idealists who had never faced frontier dangers. They were experienced survivors who had looked death in the eye and chosen compassion over expedience. Swift Eagle spoke once more, his words carrying the weight of formal ceremony. Captain Mitchell, if you give Swift Eagle chance to prove words true, we'll spend rest of life working for peace between peoples. We'll teach children in village that some white settlers can be trusted. We'll carry message to chiefs that talking better than fighting. The offer represented a genuine opportunity to break the cycle of violence that had plagued the frontier for generations. But it required Captain Mitchell to trust a man he had been trained to see as an enemy, and to violate military protocols that existed for what were considered sound strategic reasons. After what seemed like an eternity, Captain Mitchell made his decision. Against my better military judgment, and certainly against regulations, I'm going to give this experiment in diplomacy a chance to work. The relief that flooded through the gathered group was palpable, but the captain's conditions were strict and specific. Swift Eagle, you will be released under several conditions. First, you will report to me monthly about your activities and the response of your people to peace overtures. Second, any hostile action by members of your band will be considered a violation of our agreement and will result in immediate military action against your entire village. Third, Mrs. McKinnon and her family will be held responsible for ensuring your compliance with these terms. Swift Eagle accepted the conditions without hesitation, understanding that he was being given an opportunity that no other captured warrior had received. Swift Eagle agrees to all terms. Captain, will prove that trust was not misplaced. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward to address the legal implications of the arrangement. Captain Mitchell, what do I report to territorial authorities about this situation? Mitchell's response was carefully calculated to provide legal cover for everyone involved. You report that investigation revealed no evidence of hostile Indian presence at the McKinnon homestead. Mrs. Henderson's concerns appear to have been unfounded, possibly the result of frontier stress and isolation affecting her judgment. The creative interpretation of events satisfied no one completely, but it provided a framework that allowed everyone to avoid serious legal consequences while giving Swift Eagle's diplomatic mission a chance to succeed. Mrs. Henderson, despite being offered an excuse for her actions, chose to accept responsibility for the chain of events she had set in motion. Captain, my judgment may have been influenced by fear and prejudice, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to see beyond my own limitations. This family has taught me that enemies can become friends when people are willing to look past surface differences. Over the following weeks, Swift Eagle prepared for his return to the Comanche village with careful attention to the diplomatic mission he had accepted. Sarah helped him craft messages in English that could be shared with other chiefs, while the children contributed drawings and small gifts that could demonstrate the peaceful intentions of some settlers. The day of his final departure was emotional for everyone involved. Swift Eagle had become part of their daily life, and his leaving would restore their normalcy, but also remove a source of wisdom and friendship that had enriched their understanding of the world beyond their homestead. You changed us, Sarah told him, as he prepared to mount Thunder for the journey home. We'll never again be able to see Indian peoples as faceless enemies. You gave us the gift of understanding. Swift Eagle's response carried equal emotional weight. Sarah McKinnon and her children saved more than Swift Eagle's life, showed that peace possible when hearts are open to truth. Swift Eagle will carry that message to his people and to his children's children. The children's farewells were particularly touching. Samuel presented Swift Eagle with one of his father's books, asking him to learn to read English so they could share stories across the distance that would separate them. Mary gave him a carefully preserved flower pressed between sheets of paper, a token of the friendship that had grown from fear and suspicion. Emma offered her favorite hair ribbon, asking him to give it to his daughter as a gift from a little girl who had learned that different didn't mean dangerous. As Swift Eagle rode away on Thunder, the McKinnon family stood watching until he disappeared over the horizon. They knew they might never see him again, but they also knew that his influence on their lives would continue long after his physical presence was just a memory. The months that followed brought gradual changes to the frontier community around Cedar Creek. Reports filtered back through various sources that a Comanche chief named Running Bear had begun sending peace overtures to military commanders, proposing negotiations instead of raids. Some settlers remained skeptical, but others began to consider the possibility that coexistence might be preferable to endless conflict. Mrs. Henderson became an unexpected advocate for understanding between cultures, sharing her experiences at the McKinnon homestead with anyone who would listen. Her transformation from suspicious neighbor to voice for tolerance demonstrated the power of personal experience to overcome deeply held prejudices. Sheriff Coleman found that his creative handling of the Swift Eagle situation enhanced rather than damaged his reputation in the community. People respected his judgment in choosing mercy over rigid adherence to regulations, and his willingness to take risks for the greater good became a model for other difficult decisions. Captain Mitchell received commendation from territorial authorities when the peace negotiations initiated by Swift Eagle's diplomatic mission resulted in a significant reduction in raids and casualties along the frontier. His decision to trust in human decency over military protocol proved to be strategically sound as well as morally admirable. The McKinnon family themselves were changed in ways both subtle and profound. Samuel grew up with an understanding of cultural complexity that served him well when he eventually became a territorial judge known for fairness toward all peoples. Mary became a teacher who specialized in helping children from different backgrounds learn together. Emma retained throughout her life the lesson that kindness could triumph over fear. Sarah continued to live on the homestead, but she was no longer just a widow struggling to survive in a harsh environment. She had become a bridge between worlds, a living example that individuals could choose understanding over hatred, compassion over expedience. Her story spread throughout the territory, inspiring others to look beyond racial and cultural differences to the shared humanity underneath. Years later, when Swift Eagle's son came to visit the homestead where his father had been saved, he found a family that welcomed him not as a stranger or potential enemy, but as a continuation of the friendship that had begun with an act of mercy beside a creek. The young Comanche warrior carried gifts from his father and messages of continued peace, demonstrating that the bonds formed during those crucial weeks in 1847 had created connections that transcended time and distance. The story of the frontier widow who saved a dying Comanche warrior became a legend throughout the territory, not because it was unusual for people to show mercy, but because it demonstrated the power of individual choices to change the course of history. In a time and place where racial hatred seemed inevitable, where violence appeared to be the only language that different peoples could speak, one family had chosen to listen to their consciences instead of their fears. The legacy of their choice rippled outward through generations, influencing territorial policy, changing community attitudes, and providing a model for how people from different worlds could find common ground. The simple act of giving water to a wounded man had become a testament to the transformative power of human compassion. Swift Eagle kept his promises, serving as a diplomat and peacemaker until his death many years later. His village prospered under the protection of the treaties he helped negotiate, and his children grew up speaking both Comanche and English, serving as translators and cultural ambassadors between their people and the growing settler population. The friendship between the McKinnon family and Swift Eagle's band continued through multiple generations, with young people from both cultures visiting each other's communities to learn and share knowledge. What had begun as a medical emergency had evolved into a lasting bridge between two worlds that had seemed forever separated by mistrust and misunderstanding. In the end, Sarah's decision to save a dying enemy had accomplished what armies and governments had failed to achieve. She had proven that peace was possible when people were willing to see past their differences to the shared humanity that connected all peoples. Her courage in the face of social pressure and legal consequences had opened a door to understanding that remained open long after she was gone. The McKinnon homestead became a symbol of hope in a harsh land, a reminder that even in the darkest times, individual acts of kindness could illuminate paths toward a better future. The story of the widow and the warrior became a cornerstone of territorial folklore, passed down through generations as evidence that love could indeed triumph over hate, that understanding could defeat ignorance, and that one person's decision to choose mercy over vengeance could change the world.